Hi, I'm Bob Orr. Welcome to another edition of Washington Unplugged and Flashpoints with our national security analyst, Juan Zarate. And Juan, we actually begin today with some breaking news. The White House is about to announce, or has just announced, sanctions against Syria. Why are these important? What do they do?
Well, this is a new executive order targeting the senior leadership of the Syrian regime, for the first time naming Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, under the sanctions for human rights abuses and escalation of the violence against the Syrian people. This is an important marker, more so symbolically than any assets we're going to find in New York banks belonging to Assad. This is an important symbolic diplomatic marker because it suggests that we are now going after the top leadership and starting a path toward declaring the regime illegitimate. The administration isn't saying that yet, but with this act, what you're saying is this is a set of targets to include Bashar al-Assad and 6 other senior Syrian officials who should be subject to financial sanctions, should be subject to international pressure and opprobrium, and should stop and cease and desist what they're doing against their own people. So it really marks a shift forward for the Obama administration in terms of trying to put pressure on the Syrian regime.
This is something that has to happen first if there's going to be some kind of follow-on action. For the administration to come out and say down the road perhaps that Assad's administration is illegitimate.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting is financial sanctions have in many ways become the tip of the spear in terms of our diplomatic posture in terms of national security. And so here you have the sanctions serving as the first shot across the bow to say, we're starting now to really relook at our policy, starting to focus on the senior leadership. And what we're declaring now with this executive order is that these people are not only subject to asset freezes, but they are starting to become persona non grata in the financial community. And that's the first step toward the administration saying that this is an illegitimate regime. They haven't said it yet, but that's the first step.
So it's a move to start to isolate that regime, if you will. Now, why now? Does it have anything to do with what we've seen recently with the clashes along the Israel border?
Well, I think there's 2 factors. One, the violence has gotten worse. You've had the regime cracking down on dissidents and on the protesters and using a lot of violence. Secondly, you had this incident with Israel where the Syrians basically orchestrated the movement of Palestinian refugees to the border with Israel, which has caused quite a bit of consternation in Israel. A lot of concerns from a security perspective, and also concerns out of the White House that Syria is trying to both distract from what they're doing and also send some signals to the region that they can cause a lot of instability here. And so this is the White House and I think the administration firing back to say, we're going to keep our eye on you, we're going to make sure that we put pressure on you, and this is the first step in that battle back and forth.
If the manufactured incident along the border was a provocation, they certainly got a response now.
Absolutely. They've got a response there. They're getting a response with all the internal debate within Israel, which now feels quite vulnerable. There's a sense in Israel that this may be a new tactic used by the Palestinians as well as the Syrians and the Lebanese to foment instability. That is to say, release the refugees, actually have them assemble on the borders and have them move in. So you really have a challenge perhaps for the Israelis to control their borders, to not use too much violence, especially if there are women and children there. And really a sense by the Palestinians that this is an opportunity to add their voice to the Arab Spring. I think all of this in context with what's happening in the Palestinian territories is important. The announcement of the unity government between Hamas and Fatah, the march toward a declaration of a state in September at the UN, and then George Mitchell, the peace envoy, resigning from the U.S. with a signal that the peace process is just moribund. So I think all of this in context is not encouraging for either the peace process or for Israeli security, and that's why you see some tensions rising in the region.
If there was one major flashpoint, it would probably still be the ongoing problem with the U.S. Pakistan relationship. Ever since the killing of bin Laden, things have been very, very tense. Is there any sign that that's getting better? Where do we stand with this right now?
Well, the signs are mixed because there still is tension between the countries and certainly debate in the United States, especially in Congress, about whether or not funding should be cut off with Pakistan, including a debate right now about paying Pakistan for some supply shipments that have gone through Pakistan, repayment. But there have been, I think, some attempts at dampening the tension. For example, the Pakistanis have agreed to return the tail of the stealth.
But it hasn't happened yet, as far as we know.
It hasn't happened yet. They allowed some access to the 3 wives of Osama bin Laden once, right? So all this is measured. But I think, unfortunately, this relationship is going to get more tense before it gets better. In part because I think America is going to be caught with a real conundrum here. That is to say, we're probably going to find other evidence and information that leads us to other al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan. So, in my opinion, the question is going to be a very pivotal question. Do we go after these figures unilaterally, potentially inflaming tensions with Pakistan again? Or is this a moment of potential cooperation, but a moment in which you have to actually trust the Pakistanis, which we haven't been willing to do? And so I think over time you're going to have these episodes and incidents, not just diplomatically, but operationally, that will add to the tension between the countries.
Right after the killing of bin Laden, there was a lot of speculation about complicity on behalf of Pakistani government elements or elements within the intelligence services. Has anything concrete come of that? What do we know about what they knew, or if they knew?
I don't think we know yet. We saw the National Security Advisor Tom Donilon speak on this past weekend, saying there was no concrete evidence to suggest that the Pakistanis were complicit with bin Laden. Clearly, analysts are looking through the treasure trove of data found in his compound to understand whether or not that's the case, and looking at other data that may emerge in terms of the post-killing of bin Laden environment, where people are maybe scrambling, talking about what happened, to understand what was at play. I think one of the things that's interesting, Bob, is people are reassessing whether or not this could have been just a massive intelligence failure. I've reminded folks that we've had massive intelligence failures in the United States, 9/11, WMD in Iraq. Things, frankly, people around the world don't believe, because they just don't believe that America could be so blind or its intelligence so faulty. So mistakes happen. Intelligence communities and agencies miss big things. But I think the circumstantial evidence here seems to suggest some degree of complicity somewhere in the Pakistani system, and I think we're just going to wait to see if there's any concrete evidence of that.
And until that question is resolved, obviously the tension is going to remain, and even after that.
The tension is going to remain not only because of the UBL question, but because of others who remain in Pakistan, we believe. Other al-Qaeda senior leaders, as well as Taliban leaders like Mullah Omar.
You mentioned the Taliban, so it's a good place to go for our next flashpoint. There was this false start several months ago about negotiations with the Taliban. That turned out to be kind of a bogus story, but this appears to maybe have some fact behind it.
Well, I think there have been some starts and stops to the negotiations with the Taliban. Very clearly, the American administration has sent signals that we want to see a negotiated political settlement as a way of ushering the U.S. out of the region and allowing a stable Afghan sort of environment post-2014, which is when the NATO troops will pull out. So clearly it's an imperative on the part of the U.S. government and the Obama administration to have these kinds of talks and the potential for the Taliban to be reconciled, or at least some segment of it. Where we've had the start and stops is the last significant round of this was with a guy who was pretending to represent the Taliban but turned out to be a fraudster. And he was paid a lot of money, was traveling all around in these talks. It turned out not to be a representative, which underscores the danger of this, in part because it's not clear who speaks on behalf of the Taliban other than Mullah Omar, who hasn't come out of the shadows. And it's not clear that anything that these representatives, so-called representatives, agree to is actually going to hold, given that the Taliban is not a monolithic organization at this point, is made up of different factions. And it's not clear as well that they can speak for organizations like the Haqqani Network, which reside in Pakistan, in Waziristan, and have caused so much problems for Afghan troops and NATO troops on the other side of the border. So it's understandable that there's a potential political dialogue, and the reports are that there have been meetings in Qatar with Taliban representatives, with perhaps the opening of a Taliban office in Qatar or in Turkey or somewhere. But it's very hard to see how this plays out in real terms, given the fractious nature of the enemy and all of the volatility politically in Afghanistan.
You said that the Taliban is not a monolithic organization, but Mullah Omar is still at the tip, right? And as far as I know, he's not broken with al-Qaeda in any kind of official way. So does that have to happen? Does he have to be involved for this to have any kind of political hope of being real?
I think you have to have senior Taliban Quetta Shura involvement in order for there to be some semblance of a political solution here. You can imagine elements of the Taliban breaking away, and we've seen this in the past. This isn't new, where Taliban kind of joins the government for a matter of convenience or otherwise. But I think to have a full-scale solution with the entirety of the Taliban movement on board, you have to have Mullah Omar or somebody speaking at that level for the organization on board. But from an Afghan and American perspective, the conditions are fairly straightforward, either preconditions or conditions at the end of the negotiations. You have to break with al-Qaeda, you have to lay down your arms, and you have to agree to the Constitution and the political establishment in Afghanistan, which includes things like women's rights and other things that the Taliban's antithetical to.
So it's awful hard.
This is why, and I remind folks of this, Bob, that this notion of negotiating with the Taliban is not new. I mean, we had these discussions in the Bush administration. The problem is, with whom do you negotiate, and are they trustworthy, and are they really going to be willing to live up to our core demands?
And is it binding? I mean, at the
Right.
end of the day.
And I think those are still the questions that bedevil any sort of negotiations with the Taliban in this context.
All right, and we're going to end basically where we started. We talked about the sanctions from the Obama White House against Syria. Tomorrow the president makes a big speech about the Middle East. How do these things dovetail? What's he going to say?
Well, clearly I think the White House is trying to stage these actions to prepare for the president's speech, a speech that's been billed as a post-Bin Laden, a post-Arab Spring speech where he will try to define U.S. policy in the Middle East given all the tumult and all that's happening. I think the White House is trying to seize on the momentum of the messaging of the killing of Bin Laden and the momentum, or perhaps loss thereof, in the context of the Arab Spring to really set what U.S. policy is. I think this is difficult for the Obama administration. It's one of the reasons I think they announced the Syrian sanctions today, to be able to get ahead of the news cycle, to say, look, we're clearly trying to pressure the Syrian regime. We're clearly on the side of angels in terms of our policy in the region, and we're doing everything we can country by country. And they're going to emphasize that, I think, in the speech, that this is not a... though the spirit of the Arab Spring is about democracy and pluralism, each country has its own dynamic at play, and the administration is going to try to emphasize that.
Now, we haven't seen the speech, obviously, but would you expect the president to spend any time on Libya? That seems to still be a very open question.
I think he has to, because it's the one that is most festering in terms of a situation that's unresolved. You have Egypt and Tunisia, which are unresolved in the sense of not knowing where the revolutions will go.
But in process.
But in process, and the autocrats have been sort of toppled. So that's a different category. Important, but a different category. But in Libya, you have Gaddafi still in Tripoli with NATO involvement and an unsure rebel alliance that is trying to organize itself through this transitional council. And so that is sort of the most obvious of unresolved problems and conflicts, not to mention then Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, other parts of the region. So I think this is an important speech because it will lay out, I think, the president's vision for what U.S. policy and role is in the Middle East at this time. I think one of his challenges too, Bob, is how do you make sure that the U.S. is influencing what's happening without putting the U.S. as the centerpiece? And I think that's one of the challenges for the president, because he doesn't want to appear to be leading from behind, which is something that he's been criticized for, but at the same time, he doesn't want to make America the central protagonist on all this. And so that's a tough line to draw, and I think it's something he's going to try to do in the speech tomorrow.
And of course, his critics will paint it that way.
His critics will go after him for all sorts of things. You know, I've been somewhat critical of the administration on some of the post-Cairo speech elements of their policy or lack thereof, but we'll just have to see what he says. I think this is an important moment, though, because you have the loss of al-Qaeda's central leader with a real fundamental attack on some of the old principles and ideologies of the region, with a real potential opening for democracy and pluralism to take root, but that's at risk.
Interesting as always. Juan, good to see you again.
Likewise, Bob. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to all of you for watching Flashpoints. We'll see you next time.